Hello, buckaroos, and welcome to the rootinest, tootinest, shotgun shootinest, kick off your bootinest live gaming webcast this side of a Louisiana whorehouse. I am rootin' tootin' William Big T Thrasher. With me, as always, as Richard T Bosley and Brendan Cass. We are going to be your host this evening, as unfortunately Michael Jolly of our whole could not be with us. If you notice his absence on the program, he sadly is stuck in a game of Grepolis right now and just can't pull himself away to be on the show. So, Mike, we hope you can break away from Grepolis one day, clear through the withdrawal symptoms, and then join us back on the show. But until then, we've got a good show for you this evening. Tonight's topic is flawed characters, something very, very near and dear to our heart, because I can guarantee you all of our hosts are very flawed characters. But before we get into that, we do, of course, want to see what's going on with our co-publishers and our website. Brendan, what is going on with our website, d-infinity.net, this week?
Well, of course, your reference to Mike being stuck in a game of Grepolis. This blog post Mike posted while he was in Athens, Greece. He's actually in Greece right now doing research for Swords of Kos, which, of course, is Skirmisher's big campaign setting that's been working on. He was playing the game in Athens and wrote about it in Athens, so he must have some kind of addiction if he's going to be doing that. But the real cool articles on there right now are a couple of bios set in that very same Swords of Kos fantasy campaign setting that didn't make it into the Lives of Kos book. Those are right there on the front page under Crafty Lives of Kos, and are system agnostic and free for people to use in their games. Will, you wrote another series of oddities. You're up to 65 now, is that right?
I believe so. We're up to 65 oddities for a mine, and so it's all just unusual objects, items, NPCs, and encounters that adventurers might have in a mine. And it's versatile enough. You can use it for like traditional dungeon delving, swords and sorcery play, all the way up to like a modern supernatural horror type of thing.
There you go. So I mean, it'll work as a random table. So anytime you're in a mine, your characters are in a mine or some other kind of subterranean environment, then you might be able to find something to spice up your encounter or scenario or whichever. And that's one in actually it's kind of a long-running series now of oddities. We've done observatories, sewers,
Thieves Guild. Thieves Guild is a personal favorite.
Yeah, and they're all pretty good. They're all very useful, so check those out for sure.
Cool. And Richard, what is going on right now with our co-publisher, Skirmisher Publishing?
Well, as our viewers from last week will note, we did release Cat Calls at some time in the afternoon on the 1st, even though we were hoping to get it closer to midnight. But yeah, we got that out, and so for all of you GMs out there that love to torture your players, this is an adventure for you. It's basically a night in a tavern where everything that can go wrong just might. And it'll teach your players to screw with you or a tavern.
Excellent. And can you tell us anything about that adventure?
Yeah. The best part, I would say, is while there may be no tigers and bears, there are other things you should fear that might make you go, oh my. Yeah. But without trying to spoil too much of it, it's based around the concept of what do you do when you really have no option to just beat your opponent into submission.
Excellent. All right, gentlemen, I think it is time to dive headfirst into our main topic, and that is flawed characters. And just to give our audience an idea of where we're all coming from, just give your general impression of a flawed character. And I'll go ahead and give mine. In tabletop gaming, I kind of find that there are two main branches of flawed characters. Flawed characters that are built by virtue of the rules, where they are sort of front-loaded with mechanical defects and problems and failings. and then characters where it's just an inherent part of the character concept that that character has problems. And regrettably, I've seen these things come at odds time and time again. It's very rare that you'll find a system where if your character concept is an inherently flawed character, that you can bring all those flaws into the game's rules in a satisfying way. And a lot of times, a lot of flaws are just kind of left as a pure conceit of roleplay. How about you, Richard?
Well, um, they're double-edged swords because if you don't have the right game master, they're pretty much useless. And if you have the wrong players, they're equally useless. But I mean, they really do enhance the game if you use them correctly.
Very cool. And Brendan?
Yeah, my worry with flaws a lot of times is, people will opt for whimsy or like randomness. If anyone's trying to play the Mad Hatter, for example, or an equivalent character, they really know that their objective is just to derail things because they think they're more clever than I am. And while that may or may not be the case, depending on who the player is, it's really just showboating for the sake of drawing attention to people, or yourself in that case. It's like the kid that falls down on purpose while playing in the playground just to get people to look at them. But that being said, all your best characters have two aspects to them and are flawed in some way. It makes them more interesting. So I like character flaws. Will, I've definitely noticed that for the most part, you're right. You either end up role playing something and you're diligent about role playing it, but that's completely on you as a player, or it's something mechanical. And typically, if you've hosed your character mechanically, a lot of times you've also made your character unviable. So unless you're playing in a party full of people who are also playing unviable characters and your GM is able to balance the game for that, you remove yourself from making a lot of decisions that are going to drive the story forward. So it's tough to balance, but when it is balanced, I think it adds a lot of depth to the game.
Yes, actually, you mentioned that because there's a lot of I've noticed in a lot of games I've run where a character that is perfectly viable because of one flaw that was taken at character creation, assuming it's a system that allows you to take specific flaws at character creation, because a player didn't consider the ramifications of the flaw they took, they come to perceive their own character as unviable. I go back to a cyberpunk game I ran back in college where one of the players decided their character was mute and carried a voice synthesizer with them that they would speak through. And there were certain basic penalties to social roles. Since none of the characters took sign language, and in that system you got sign language for free if you were mute or deaf. No one else in the party took sign language, so if anything ever happened to that voice synthesizer, that character had no way to communicate with the other players. And it was one of those things, every now and then circumstances would cause that voice synthesizer to not be an option for that character, whether they were exposed to an EMP and the voice synthesizer got shorted out, or whether they were doing a stealth mission and all comms, including the voice synthesizer, had to be deactivated, or else they would get spotted. And that was like one thing I noticed. The player had no problems with this flaw until the moment it actually inconvenienced them, and then they took a very quick leap to, well, my character is obviously useless. And I certainly didn't think so. And as a GM, I'm not trying to be cruel, but if you took that flaw, it's going to have to affect you at some point.
Right.
And despite the fact that this is a cyberpunk setting where she could get a cybernetic implant to give her character the power of speech, instead, she had her character die, and then made a new character for the game that was the exact same character, except they didn't have the flaw mute.
It's Velma's glasses, right? Effectively the same thing. It serves the same purpose. It makes the character a liability every once in a while because one object is removed, and that's a mechanism that you can use, whether it's a voice synthesizer or glasses. But it's, you know, it's an adventure hook as much as anything else, or at least it's an encounter hook. I'd have to agree that your player there was definitely overreacting when they said they were unviable, because yeah, you can act on your own. You can take actions independent of others if you can't speak. You know, or other people can try to do something clever to work with you. I mean, that sounds like someone who has trouble dealing with adversity in general. And even if they didn't have a flaw, if it looked like their party was running into a situation that was tough, they might give up. But yeah, the object dependence defect is definitely one that gets used in a lot of stories.
Actually, that's something else you had commented on. You know, turning that kind of object dependence into kind of it can be used to motivate the story. I think that's something I think a good GM needs to do. You know, if you have players or characters in the party that have flaws, you know, don't just use them to inconvenience the players when it's appropriate to the story. Find ways to turn those flaws into story hooks. Mm-hmm. Perfect example with that voice synthesizer. It was a cyberpunk setting. At one point, that voice synthesizer got hacked, and one of their enemies was actually using it to record every message that she sent using the voice synthesizer. And there was a lot of sensitive information in there that their antagonists were recording and were going to use against them later. Another great example is when you have like a character that has, and this is really good in fantasy, or to a certain extent sci-fi if the right genetic engineering exists. If you have a character with a pretty significant physical defect, and then at some point a spiritual being or a mad scientist shows up and says, I can give you your arm back. You just got to do one favor for me.
Right. Yeah.
And that just becomes leverage.
Yep.
Yeah, I think that's a thing that a lot of players don't get. And this is one of my pet peeves. It drives me just unbelievably nuts when I see people do this. I write about it all the time with archetypal characters, right? The heroes are heroic not because they're like these badass characters, but because they have flaws that they learn to overcome. I mean, they learn to work around the very thing that would make them turn into a villain or a character who's destined to fail. And so, like, when you have players who do stuff like this, it's just a sign that they don't get what it is that they're supposed to be doing, and how overcoming that challenge by figuring out new ways to do that, to replicate what it is that they're missing, is exactly what they're supposed to be doing. Okay, so maybe that character can't speak, right? But there's other things that they can use, like sign language or drawing something on a piece of paper, or hell, even just writing a message in dirt. And that would solve the problem momentarily, right? I mean, yeah, it takes away from the element of surprise because everybody has to look at that message. At least they are contributing to the story. They're actually adding to the element and increasing the drama by actually taking away that element of surprise. Just because you can't get the jump on your opponents doesn't mean that your character is less heroic. It means they're more heroic when they win the encounter.
Right. Yeah, it heightens the sense of drama. I was thinking the exact same thing, Richard. I think that was a good point. Good flaws, and flaws that are role played well. They're something that your characters are already aware of. So when you go into a situation. For example, one of our archetypical NPCs in the Swords of Coast fantasy setting is a cleric of Poseidon who happens to be pyrophobic, right? So whenever he's going into an encounter, it's always, oh God, please let there not be fire. Every time you go into that situation, so before you even begin the encounter, there's that that level of drama, of unease that gets added to whatever that base level of unease is because you're going into a new encounter. You never know what you're going to run into. But then you start problem solving. You start thinking in new ways. Well, oh God, what am I going to do if there is fire? How am I going to deal with this? Well, he happens to be a priest of Poseidon, so he's got a lot of watery powers that he can call on to solve those problems. But and I see this a lot as well. You know, players will take on the defect. A lot of times when there's a game mechanic that includes defects, it offsets it with some sort of benefit. Well, they'll try to undo that defect somehow so that they permanently don't have to deal with it anymore. I don't think that's really a good way to do it if you're trying to role play it well. You should try to circumvent it by role playing the defect. Use water to put out fires. Don't give me some half-assed, hypnotism quest about how you're not pyrophobic anymore or something like that. That's not as entertaining.
Actually, Brendan, I'm glad you brought that up. My least favorite kind of defect in any game is a defect that you can just brush off. Back in high school, I was running a Werewolf: The Dark Ages campaign, and they made characters with merits and flaws, which was the old World of Darkness system, which was one of those. Well, that's a whole other game design issue. But the whole point is one of the characters was this kind of crusading knight type character who took as a flaw ward, which meant that there was another human being, an NPC that you were responsible for, and
Okay.
the ward was the daughter, the last surviving daughter of like another crusading knight who he had rescued and basically took it upon himself to raise her. Well, the moment they got their adventure hook, he went into the scullery, gave the girl to the scullery maid and said, "Wench, you will watch this child," and then left. And that was it.
That's not a ward. That's someone not really understanding it's their own character concept, and they don't understand their own character concept.
Oh yeah. Well, he just
I'd be
wanted
pretty
the extra
frustrated
4
with that.
points to dump into magic powers or skills or something.
Yeah.
And the thing is, regrettably, that was an abbreviated. It was high school. That was an abbreviated campaign. I had already had planned out all the horrible things that were going to happen to him when he came back from his quest,
Right.
and the ward wasn't there.
Yeah.
And he was going to find out that it turns out she wasn't the only surviving member of that family.
Sure.
There was another relative who had been looking for her this whole time.
Yeah. Right. Well, then
And
he should be punished. I mean, I'm not it's not necessarily the GM's role to mete out punishments because it's not a court, right? You're playing a game, but at the same time, if you neglect one element of your character, of the rules or whatever, it should come back to bite you. So it's goodwill that you didn't just let her get away with it. It's very similar to what players do with NPCs in general. And I know we've commented about this once in the past. It's not exactly a character flaw, but players will hire some minions, right? They'll get some hirelings in the tavern. They'll have 1 or 2 NPCs or whatever, and they'll just send the NPCs in to do the thing for them. Well, first off, why are you playing the game if you want the NPCs to do it? And second, well, they're not as good as you are, and they're not as committed. So I guarantee you, whatever flunky you end up sending in is not going to succeed, because if whatever flunky could have done it already, then that reward for the quest would be gone. Then someone would have already done it if it was that easy. So yeah, similar. I digress a little bit, but typically characters are defective when it comes to their interactions with NPCs in general. Whenever they have NPCs on their team,
they don't treat them like they're real people.
no, they're an expendable resource. They might as well be potions.
So you mean Godwig, right?
Right.
Ladies and gentlemen, we are being joined by our friend and guest commentator from Down Under, Heath. How you doing?
Good, and how are you?
Oh, doing pretty well.
Uh,
Well, before...
Sorry, I'm a little...
Pardon?
So I was going to say, sorry, I'm a little bit late, but that's my character flaw, timing.
Well,
Excellent.
and you're upside down right now, so that's another flaw, right? I mean, you must have blood rush to your head all the time.
Oh, you get used to it. What you counter it by hanging upside down like a bat when you go to bed, and that way it's sort of you're then the right way up.
Gotcha. I gotcha. Okay.
Good solution. All right. Well, before we get into our questions and comments from our other viewers, Heath, do you want to just give us a general impression about your sense of character flaws in tabletop gaming?
From what I caught of the banter earlier while I was running around doing my housework, someone who takes a character flaw just to dump points into something, that's a cop-out. And I tell you what, the GM has my full permission to absolutely exploit that minor flaw, major flaw, to the maximum full extent of the GM's law. I think character flaws, if you're going to take a character flaw, you need to stop and you need to think and you go, all right, this needs to be an intrinsic part of what my character is. This is not just a cop-out for extra points. I've actually sat down and discussed with a GM, DM, storyteller, whoever with a character concept, and they've looked at me and gone, you know, is this really part of the character? And I'm like, well, yeah, I want it to be. And they said, do you reckon you'll be able to pull it off? You know, are you going to be able to play someone who's afraid of the light, afraid of the dark, something like that? And you sit there and you look at it, you look at the group and you go, maybe not. And they say, no, that's cool. Look, we can work around it, and that's a good part of it. But yeah, using a flaw to cop out for points is counterproductive to the game. And I can guarantee that if someone takes a character flaw for points, it will be counterproductive to the game, and I don't think people will enjoy what they're doing.
So Heath makes me want to ask a question, because this is something that I struggle with, because I find that players in general won't, unless it's something integral to their character concept. Like, for example, I have one of my players who's currently playing a bipolar wizard, and when she is depressed, she casts fire spells to make herself feel better, and when she's feeling manic, she casts ice spells to make her make her calm down. So she's self-medicating with her magic. So that's part of his character concept. So he plays that, but there's no rules for that. He doesn't even have to do it. He just does it because he feels like it. But when your game actually has mechanics for the defects, I find that players don't tend to self-report when it comes time to actually feel the effects of that. And what I've ended up doing a lot of times is right next to my initiative list, right? I've also got my defects list, so I run through it at the same time, you know, with each character. So when one character's initiative comes up, oh, I see what their list of defects is. But it's a little bit clunky. I end up having to write it down every time, you know, we start a new initiative. How do you guys keep track of all those defects and actually make sure that they see play? Or are you just that much better at remembering everybody's flaws than I am?
Well, in my case, if it's a defect that has like a real firm mechanical effect, like you take a penalty on a certain type of skill roll, that I usually don't write down, because that can be written down on that player's character sheet. You know, they can see on their skill totals that they have a lower total, and that's the total that they'll be working off of. If it's something, you know, more story related, like having an arch nemesis, or once per game an inexplicable supernatural phenomenon happens around them or something like that, I actually do that. I just have at the top of my campaign notes, I have every character's name, what their biggest, most interesting character flaws are, both mechanical character flaws and just things in their character concept that could be considered flaws, and then next to that, who their top allies and enemies are. And that's what I do. It's just, you know, some real simple bookkeeping, and I try to look to that, you know, every hour or so, just to remember whether I brought any of those things into play appropriately at some point during the play session. How about you, Richard?
Yeah, I've had several problems with this with some of my players in the past. A lot of them don't want to let you know what their flaws are after they've built the character, and they don't want to give you a copy of their character sheet either.
They gotta give you character.
Right.
Yeah.
And so one of the things that I do is I will make sure that I know what their flaws are, and if they don't tell me what their flaws are, one of two things are going to happen. I get to screw the hell out of your character whenever I feel like it, because you won't give me a list of all your flaws, or two, you just don't get to have that flaw, and whatever bonus points you have, you can kiss them damn things goodbye. because that's pretty much how it's going to work. And it's not because I want to be an asshole about everything. It's like with everybody else here. It's the integrity of the story that you got to try to protect. And if you're going to take those flaws, you got to be willing to pay the price for having them. I mean, that's why you get the cool abilities in exchange for them, is so that way you're better at some things than you are at others. Let somebody else take the limelight in that situation. That's pretty much what I try to get them to do. If you don't want the flaw to affect you, step back and let somebody else deal with it.
Right, right.
Heath, do you have an angle on this?
Having not really been too much of a GM or a DM, I know the GM that I usually game with. He's fairly good with remembering characters' flaws and their perks, feats, burns, whatever you want to call them. I have known GMs to use the notes along the top of the GM screen with just sort of point note things to lists to remember what each of the characters has or haven't got and that sort of thing. But just touching on something Richard said, when you're saying about keeping a list of flaws and how people may have just a general flaw in your character. The GM that I usually play with, I love him like a brother, but he's a bugger for that, and he knows that if someone plays a character a certain way and he can exploit that, it's like the character has taken a flaw for free for the GM, and he will run with that.
Very cool. Well, before we get into our questions and comments from viewers, just wanted to give a shout out to our viewer in Cebu City. I hope you're having a good time watching the show live. And first comment comes from Todd DeWitt, who says, perfect characters make for boring games, and I completely agree. I don't care if you're a fighter with 29 strength and can one-round a dragon. The better story is how the elderly rogue with Parkinson's decided to relive his glory days and managed to pick every lock at the money changers and left legible calling cards in the safety deposit box that no one will recognize. And I love that kind of thing. I actually love characters that come in with a history, but a history that does, impede them in some way. The elderly thief who's developing like arthritis. I think that's a really cool character. That's a character with something to prove, and that's awesome motivation.
Yeah, definitely.
All right, next comes from Richard Penwarden. Does the Coast setting encourage traditional Greek-style heroes with epic-level flaws, like the Oracle of Delphi, able to predict the future but at the cost of no one believing her? Or Oedipus, destined to slay his father and marry his mother, so he banishes himself as a traveler in a strange land and still causes these horrible events to happen? I would say one thing about Swords of Coast is, it is system free. It's system agnostic. So a lot of it has to do with whether or not you're going to take it from a system angle and are going to use Swords of Coast as part of a system that encourages those kind of flaws. But I would say yes. I mean, that's all sort of just an undercurrent of the Greek and sort of Aegean mythic structure of having these larger-than-life fates and destinies. That's one of the reasons why I wrote up so many cursed characters in Lives of Kos. There's just a lot of those NPCs have already been cursed and suffered a horrible predestined fate, or are on the verge of suffering some horrible predestined fate.
And it's definitely true. I think Richard, you, me, we've all written characters for Lives of Kos, and most every single one of them has some form of flaw, right? Even the guy who runs the Hermesium, the brokerage, he has issues with his past. Other characters, have some form of nemesis or some such, but yeah, the Swords of Coast setting was heavily influenced by the storytelling style of Greek myths, and because of that, it's any character with that kind of defect, even one of those more epic defects, like Oedipus, for example, is definitely at home there. since a lot of our characters have tensions built into them. The NPCs have these interpersonal tensions built into them. They don't get along with such and such a person or anything or something like that. And a lot of the times those interpersonal tensions are a reference to a Greek story. Medea, for example, shares a name with a woman who drowned her husband's babies. Her husband happened to be the king of Athens. So, you know, and she runs a tavern in Fort Carpathios, which is inspired by the Keep on the Borderlands. So, yeah, long answer to that question, but yeah, definitely.
And we are going to be working on coming up with rules for various systems, so that way you can use flaws. Because if you look at some of the products that Skirmisher has done, there are products with flaws already in them.
Yeah.
Why, are you talking about the Gesture Dragon's Guide to Defects?
Why, yes, I am.
For OGL and coming soon for Pathfinder?
Yes.
A
But
book
so,
of over 150 character flaws, illustrated by yours truly, with style and panache. All right, that was the most satisfying plug I think I've had all week. All right, our next comment comes from, our next question comes from Wayne Wells, who wants to know, who says, I do a lot of superhero games, and somebody always wants to do a low-rent Wolverine character with a disadvantaged loner in a game that's about a superhero group. This is something that I absolutely can't stand, are systems that have flaws that are almost inherently disruptive to the party. And sometimes even disruptive, you know, to the themes of the game. And a perfect example is a superhero system. It's assumed in most superhero games that you're playing a superhero team, your Justice League, your Fantastic Four. Well, if you've got a loner, that's immediately disruptive to gameplay, because now you have somebody who now system-wise is going to be required or encouraged to break away from the party. That disrupts and causes the GM to have to separate and budget his time in a very unfun way. And regrettably, I mean, that's just a flaw that's obviously going to be disruptive to the functioning of the party. There are so many flaws that don't have to be disruptive to the party that I would say more than half the time become disruptive to the party. Flaws like kleptomania. You always end up stealing from your teammates. That's just, you know, a prime example. We've talked about Kender on the show before. How do you all feel about that?
actually, I have no problem with it, because I mean, one of the things that does happen quite often in various adventures, and this is applicable to superhero campaigns, is splitting the party. So fine, if that character wants to play this, or the player wants to play a character who's a loner, then let them. But let them also face a host of problems because of that. If they're going to go off on their own, let them have the snot beat out of them regularly. So, you know, like they sure, they might uncover the important clue that nobody else found because they went off and did whatever, but they got trashed for it, and then the rest of the group has to pick up the slack. Because then you solve the problem of ensuring that they play out their character flaw and seeing what the results of that is going to be. Is the rest of the group is going to be hurt by the loss of that person's abilities for the rest of the adventure, or until that person recovers?
Yeah. Go ahead.
Yes?
There must be a bit of lag today where I'm not pedaling fast enough for the signal to be accurate. Look, I think, and not being a cop-out and coming back to my game balance theory, but if you've got the right kind of player and you've got the right kind of DM, then I think loner could work. But I'd say 3/4 of the time in groups that I've been in, it wouldn't have worked. I think there's been one time with the GM that I normally play with one other player, successfully had the loner trait and would go off and do little things by himself as just a segue. The GM was good enough that he would keep step with any sort of XP or experience, that sort of thing. So it didn't become a case of, here's the rest of the group, here's the guy doing his stuff, all of a sudden, well, you're 10 levels ahead of where they are, they come back, and you make everyone feel like they're a non-valuable part of the group, and then the game sort of loses its balance to make it fun for the rest of the group. So I'll say, depending on the player and the GM, and it's got to be an exceptional circumstance for any of those flaws like loner that would otherwise, break the game.
Brendan.
Yeah. Well, I mean, we've talked about splitting the party any number of times on the show. We all know Mike is very against splitting the party. He finds it particularly insulting to him as a DM because he's the one who had to bust his ass to pull the adventure together, and here people are throwing it off the rails by splitting the party. That being said, I think defects like that can be manageable, but they're manageable at a tactical level. They're very difficult to manage when people are actually trying to split the story. That is, you're not in a tactical situation and someone is walking somewhere else and advancing the story in a different way from the group. The issue then is, well, how do you deliver that piece of the story to that person without providing meta information to the rest of the group? Now, good players won't act on meta information, but it does actually ruin their experience in the story if certain information is revealed to them that they then have to know they know it and then pretend they don't. It just adds an extra burden to the player. So that's a pain in the ass. So then what do? Do you write notes and pass them to the player? Well, you could do that, but that takes time, and then you start to ignore the rest of the group. But once you're in tactical time, it becomes okay because you're taking turns. That guy might be over there, but you're dealing with individuals on an individual basis as each person takes their turn anyway. And then I'd have to completely agree with Richard. You disincentivize that kind of behavior by beating the crap out of them. Because that's why you're working in a team in the first place. If you could do it on your own, and it's kind of going to sound similar to what I was talking about with the NPCs. If the NPCs could have finished your adventure for you, they already would have. If you could have done it by yourself, you wouldn't be part of a team. You'd have already done it. So you definitely have to make sure you're diligent about disincentivizing that kind of behavior, because being a loner is a disadvantage. It's not being the cool guy with the leather jacket and the motorcycle that everyone wants to be around. It's a disadvantage. You're a less effective member of the party because you feel this urge to operate by yourself.
And there's a couple things I got to throw in here that Brendan's mentioning and build off of that. Yeah, you can put somebody off on the side while they're like in a tactical situation, but if you know you already have this character, you can plan ahead and have those notes prepared in envelopes or something, so you can just pass that information over to them, so you can avoid that slowdown. But in terms of characters, you see this in superhero stories a lot. So like Wolverine and The Question, right? I know one's Marvel, one's DC, but they have the same things basically happen to them. They get the hell beat out of them all the time for going it alone. The Question doesn't trust anybody, not even other superheroes. He takes shit from everyone, and that's part of his flaw of being a loner, of being the paranoid guy who's always got to find dirt on everybody. Is he's got to put up with the fact that nobody's ever going to trust him fully, regardless of his intentions.
Yeah, but he and the Huntress hit it off.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, you have those rare occasions where you do have those friendships that do develop between the loner and somebody else. But even with those friendships in place, that character's still going to be tortured day in and day out for the rest of their lives because they are loners. That's just the way they work. And the player's got to accept that.
All right, next question comes from Tom Payne, who wants to know, other than really obvious things like a dwarf miner that's afraid of the dark, are there really any flaws that can't be overcome? And I'm going to say I don't believe in flaws that can't be overcome or transcended in some way. No matter how debilitating, no matter how crazy a flaw is, there is always some way to move past it, whether that means removing the flaw, changing the flaw into an asset, working around the flaw. It's all about just coming up with the right context. Like I said, a character is missing an arm. There's really not that many ways to. You can't really grow back an arm, but in a fantasy or science fiction game, someone can make that offer, or maybe you find the magic or technology that makes it possible. If you have an NPC character that has sworn a vendetta against you and will not stop until you and your entire family are dead, well, that's pretty debilitating. But at some point, you might have a decisive victory against this villain, or you might turn that villain into an ally. I think there is always a way to turn a flaw into something else, whether it's another flaw or an advantage or something along those lines.
What was the game system? Was it second edition D&D with its defects that your character could be dead before they even started if you picked the right collection of defects?
I'm not sure. I know in Traveler and Mutant Chronicles that you could die during character creation, but I'm not aware.
Those might be
Dragon's Guide to Defects. I'm not aware of any game where the right defect combination gets your character killed.
It might be the ones you're talking about where you could die in character creation, because that's really the only situation where I could see a defect being a complete showstopper because you're dead.
Unless, of course, the game is about what happens to you after you die, and there are a few of those.
True.
Wraith.
Yep,
Yeah,
Wraith.
the
That's a
Risen.
good one. Oh, Risen, Mummy, Witchcraft by C.J. Corella actually has some pretty good rules for playing a ghost and various other types of undead.
See,
To
answer this question in regards to the flaws, to be in addition to being possible to overcome them, you have to keep in mind the scale of the setting, because that makes all the difference. Because you can have a story about a person who's in a wheelchair who has to solve a crime or something, and like there might be no elevator because they're in an old building, right? But they know that the thing that they need to do is either go up a flight of stairs or get down them to do whatever they need to, right? But the story doesn't just stop because of that. I mean, look at the Bone Collector, right? Denzel Washington plays a character who's in a hospital bed in his own house, and the only way he can solve the crimes is to have somebody else go collect the evidence for him. He can't do a damn thing for himself. But yet that doesn't make the movie any less suspenseful or epic for his ability to contribute to solving the mystery.
Very cool. That's a movie I need to check out again. I haven't seen that in ages.
And
Just the other day.
there's nothing in any rule book that says that not only can you not have a character like that, but that you get less experience for contributing to the solving of an adventure, because you are just as much of an integral part of it, just even though you didn't actually have to punch anybody.
Right.
Next question comes again from Tom Payne, who wants to know, if a player ignores their flaw or repairs it within the game mechanics, can't they be smacked down with a new flaw via the GM watching for that sort of tactic? And I think yes, and I don't think GM should punish players, although there may be times where you really, really want to. It's all about sort of managing expectations and managing interesting consequences for the player's actions in game. But yeah, that's actually that Werewolf the Dark Ages game where the guy had the flaw ward and then immediately handed his ward off to an NPC. Well, the plan was, had that campaign continued into its third week, his ward flaw was going to be replaced with an equal point valued enemy flaw, because it was going to turn out that ward had one last relative who had now sworn vengeance against him for abandoning what was going to turn out to be a very important child. So in a point buy system, that can be very, very easy because you can just find an equivalent flaw to swap the repaired flaw or abandoned flaw out with, and just as long as it makes sense within the story.
And you have to keep in mind that people, when they overcome adversity, a lot of times they'll also pick up some other quirk along the way. Say, for example, someone who has been dieting very heavily to lose a lot of weight, and so they started off with the defect obese, and then they lost that weight. Well, now all of a sudden maybe they're malnourished, or they're left sickly for that reason, or someone very, very heavy has all of that extra skin, so they might end up with the monstrous look-alike defect or something like that. But a lot of times, when you lose a defective trait about your person, you end up gaining another one. Someone who's very dirty and decides to clean up their act might end up being obsessive compulsive by the end of it, and teaching themselves to do that. So that's another element to keep in mind. You don't just lose a defect. You typically have to trade something in order to get there, or you wouldn't have ended up with the defect in the first place.
In some systems, you can buy it off, but it's really expensive, and it has to be within the context of the campaign. Otherwise, it's just not even worth having the flaw in the first place.
Now, Heath, you had a question for us.
Yeah. Has anyone actually played a character with a flaw? Like, not just a little minor flaw, like, I get paper cuts a lot. Like with a fairly decent to major flaw, and had it really work for them. Like, I mean, obviously flaws don't work, but had the character become a really fun, playable character. I had one in, I think it was my second ever D&D character back in sort of AD&D, and on the cusp of going into skills and powers. I'm not sure if I'm allowed to mention that. I know there was a lot of people not fans of skills and powers. But it was a human mage with a homebrew kit for being a militant wizard, sort of a battle leader type thing, and it was based loosely on Haplo from the Deathgate cycle. In fact, I actually called him Haplo because I just finished reading those books. And his flaw, as the character was in the books, was seawater. If he got covered in at least a pint or more of seawater, his magic for the day was gone. All memorized spells gone. And it gave me a fairly decent payoff. I think it was either extra points for something or additional spells that I could use. But if he even got like, and one of the characters took advantage of him, actually carried around, unbeknownst to him at the time, a canteen full of seawater and dumped it on him one day. And I tell you what, I played my character perfectly because he went absolutely mental at this character. And then it became a game within a game that, what was he up to? What was he going to do? Was he, how was he going to goad my character into doing something on the threat of being smothered with seawater?
Yes, I guess in my case, this was in a LARP. This was in a Shadowrun LARP I played in at Gen Con in 2004 called I Fought the Law, which all took place in the maximum security prison. And the character that I was assigned was based loosely on Charles Manson. And his whole character flaw was, he was insane and completely out of touch with the world outside of prison. I mean, there was his mind was just a jumble of these very sort of threatening neuroses. So that's how I played it. I played it as the guy who was already pretty unhinged, who just went complete bug nut after being institutionalized in this prison for decades. And all that stuff were supposed to be flaws, but and it did hold me back. It made a lot of social interactions very difficult, but it actually had some advantages. No character wanted to screw with me during the game because everyone was absolutely terrified that because I was so crazy, if I got angry, I would whip out some crazy thing, whether it was a hell of a lot of magic or some weird physical prowess. They just, everyone kind of felt, anyone who's that crazy must have some way to back it up. And interestingly enough, the character didn't. He was old and frail because he had been in prison for so long and had done so many weird, poorly motivated hunger strikes. It was absolutely great. It was very fun. And the whole Manson impression was based on Bob Odenkirk's Manson impression from the old Ben Stiller show. How about you, Richard?
I've played characters with flaws. I don't know how successful I was with them, but I did try to play them as best as I could within the confines of the game. So unfortunately, I don't have any good stories other than playing a pyromaniac wizard, a fire mage, and those were fun times. But got in a lot of trouble real fast with that character. Didn't live long.
How about you, Brendan?
Yeah, a lot of your basic defects like pyromania or kleptomania, things that most people will jump to when they think defects, end up landing that character or their party in jail or excommunicated from a community. I find that the defects that I end up gravitating toward are substance dependencies. Just because a lot of good characters end up having them. Your old detective movies, they're all addicted to nicotine and alcohol, right? So I'll enjoy those just because it's something that can be fixed. But when the situation gets really stressful and you've been in a dungeon for a long time and you've killed whatever flask of liquor that you have left, and things start to get down to the wire, it becomes a little bit interesting. But if you're in a normal situation where you don't need that heightened level of drama, you can more or less take care of it. In any normal society, you can handle it. Those are probably the most successful ones I've played.
Well, I had my own personal question to bring up the show, and I wanted to ask you guys, what is your of all the different RPGs you've played, what is your favorite system for character flaws, and what's your least favorite system for character flaws? If you don't want me starting, I would say my least favorite would be the old World of Darkness merits and flaws systems. Not that it was bad, but I felt that it was very, very poorly implemented. The point benefits for flaws ranged from, I believe, like 1 to 7, and a lot of the 1 to 2 point flaws, which it was very easy to load a character up with, there was nothing mechanical attached to them. There'd be like the flaw rude. Your character is rude. But that's it. You don't take any penalties in social situations. You just get 1 bonus point for saying your character's rude, whether you play that out or not. Whereas a person who just decides that, I think my character would be pretty rude, gets nothing for it. And I really don't like that. If you receive a mechanical benefit from a flaw, like extra build points or whatnot, I really feel like there should be some mechanical penalty for that flaw. I don't like flaws that are just role-playing guidelines. As far as best, I am a huge fan of in addition to my own work, the Jester Dragon's Guide to Defects, as far as just a cool, innovative flaw system, is the one in Hollow Earth Expedition, where the flaws give you absolutely nothing at character creation. And if you want, you can flat out declare that your character has every flaw in the book. That's entirely up to you. The way the flaws work is, in the game, every character has a small pool of luck points. But if you have an assigned flaw, and you get luck points for having that flaw when you choose to have that flaw have a negative impact on your character. So, for instance, if you have the flaw bad eyesight, you get a luck point if you tell the GM that your character just lost their glasses in the middle of a firefight. Or if you have the flaw trusting, you get a luck point when the bad guy says, "Trust me," and you choose to trust him. It's really great because I like the control that it actually gives the players over their characters' flaws, and it's great. You are rewarded for playing out those flaws in a really fun way.
That's smart. I like that it makes it a mechanic that players would actually like to invoke. I have I'm working on a similar system in the Swords of Infinity role RPG system, which involves characters pushing past whatever their normal physical or mental limits would be. But of course, these things have some sort of negative side effect. But you're successful, and it adds to the level of the feeling of heroism, I guess, in the story, even though they're still technically failing. So you fail your roll, and whatever your difference that you would need ends up becoming a detriment to you in order to force the success. And I think Fate does something similar as well, that you can sort of announce such and such a detriment is, but it's a little bit softer in Fate and a little bit more crunchy in mine, which I like, because it's something that players get the option of electing, and then you work that into the story as it goes along, and they're able to tell everybody else, how exactly this negative situation is impacting them. But because they're willing to accept that negative situation, they're still successful in a heroic way. We're talking about the guy who pushes the baby out from underneath the closing door and ends up having it close on his leg, that sort of thing, right? It encourages that style of gameplay, which you see a lot in books and movies, but is not necessarily reproduced as often in role-playing games.
Heath, do you have a stance on this?
Given that I haven't played the wide scope of games that you guys have, there was a retro. I don't know what's the analogy. Not one of the mainstream games like D&D or Cyberpunk or the Star Wars D6 system. There was a little clone of a game about 15, 18 years ago. I played. Someone had. And I, for the life of me, cannot remember the name of it, but I'll know it when I see it, because it had a thing where you could actually take, like, I think they called them boons and banes or something like that. But the floors, if you took a floor to counterpay for a feat, now, I don't mind if you've got to take 2 floors to get some cool feat, but this thing, you had, the points-wise, you had to take 4 or 5 fairly major floors to pay for an extra feat of some kind, and I just thought, it doesn't balance the game. That you got to be to get an extra thing, you've got to take so many bad things to just get one more cool thing. And the name we'll probably finish the broadcast, and then the name will come to me, but I can't remember. But other than that, no real favourite system for floors or anything like that. I just remember that I played a game where the floors pained me something severely, but I'm having a moment, and maybe that's my flaw as well as timing, is memory loss. At work, I wear a badge with my name on it, and some days I think that's a good thing.
How about you, Richard?
The worst system I've seen. Well, I mean, you kind of hit the nail on the head with the old White Wolf system, because it was really terribly done. But barring that, I would have to say that most point-buy systems are like that, like GURPS and to some extent Hero. Like you have some pretty wonky mechanics in there that can make the flaw less pronounced than it should be. The best system, I would have to say, is Fate that I've seen, and the reason why is because your character, other than a few skills, everything is basically an idea. Like, you have a concept. That's your entire character, right? And then you have a couple of traits. Now, those traits are both your power and your weakness, depending on how they're invoked, right? And so if you don't have enough fate points to resist anything, then somebody can compel you to do something. But by being compelled, you get a fate point that you can use later on in the game to to accomplish something. Like, so if you need a bonus on a roll or something like that, you can spend a fate point. So the currency of the game is built around the role playing of your character's concepts. So you have an inbuilt flaw system that piggybacks on the things that makes your character cool.
Very cool. Well, I think we've had a wonderful discussion about flaws this evening. So all that leaves us with is our final thoughts before we sign off. And I just do want to make an announcement. Next week is Gen Con. And so some of us will be at the convention. Some of us will be in Greece with Michael playing Grepolis. Some of us will be in Australia or California or who knows where. But the short of it, with the hustle and bustle of Gen Con, we are not going to do a regular episode next week. We're going to have a little bit of a hiatus. But that does not mean D-Infinity Live is going to be completely gone. I will be doing some mini updates from live from Gen Con, so you'll see those on our website, d-infinity.net. And I guess that's my final thought. Just look for those mini updates, and we will have, I'm sure, lots of things to share with you and lots of stories to tell once we get back and can do our next regular show in 2 weeks' time. Brendan, what are your final thoughts?
Well, I'd like to tie in my final thoughts to the D-Infinity website because I maintain and watch after it like my own child. Go to the website, go to the search box, type in the word defect. Since we're talking about character flaws, you will find hours worth of reading on all sorts of defects that you can integrate into your game. So check that out. They're all free, obviously. They're all well written, and we all held up to the same high standards that we hold all of our other stuff up to. So very useful.
All right, and Richard?
I would have to say buy catcalls if you don't have it yet. And and on the topic of flaws, keep in mind that secrets are also a type of flaw, which is what I did for most of the characters that I wrote for Lives of Coast. They all have secrets of some sort.
Ah. So mysterious, Richard.
All right, we will go ahead and give our final thought to our special guest, Heath.
Game-wise, my mantra is keep it balanced, keep it fun. Flaws can be very fun. Like I said, I had a character that I had a major flaw, and he was incredibly fun to play. I think once flaws overtake the actual enjoyability of a game, then you're doing it wrong. Well, in my opinion, you're doing it wrong, and just enjoy the game. It is a game, people. It is a game. I've seen characters go crazy on little things, but maybe that's my flaw. So we've got memory loss, timing, and I forget what the third one was.
Hypersensitivity to your own flaws.
I know that I was playing it up to the second floor.
You know what? We need to add that to the Pathfinder edition of the Jester Dragon's Guide to Defects. Obsessed with defects, where your character has to make a will save to not talk about all the problems they have because of their defects.
Chris Van Deelen has that defect.
Ah, very astute point.
Yeah.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, this has been D-Infinity Live. So for myself, William T. Thrasher, for Richard T. Balsley, for Brendan Cass, and for our special guest Heath, this has been our flawed discussion about flaws, and we will see you all in 2 weeks, unless you see our mini episodes from Gen Con. Bye, everybody.